Grizzlies podcast. The Grizzlies are a team with many inconsistencies right now, but one clear truth about this team is that Ja Morant is the best player. However, another clear truth that is emerging is who the second best player is. Why that's Dillon Brooks and why that's exactly who this Grizzlies team needs right now as their second best player. Plus, a very impressive win over the Houston Rockets and what lineups are emerging for the Grizzlies to really rely on to get better results moving forward. All that in this edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Let's get it going.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Once again, my name's Sean Coleman. It is a pleasure, as always, to be with you. Hope wherever you are, wherever you're listening, and wherever you're watching, you are having a great start to your day. You can find myself at StatsSAC on Twitter, the show at Locked On Grizz. Obviously, the podcast free on all platforms: Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the Odyssey app. Wherever you choose to listen to podcasts, that's where we will be. And also, obviously, right here on YouTube. Make sure you hit that subscribe button below. Lets us know you enjoy the show. Lets others find the show, and just makes the overall experience best it can be for everybody involved. My name is Sean Coleman, credentialed media member with the Grizzlies. I've been covering the Grizzlies now for 4 years. Your host here at Locked On Grizzlies, your Grizzlies every day. I want to also thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen of the day. Before your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NBA podcast. What is so great about the Chicago Bulls, plus teams that are continuing to struggle to start the season? That and much more on each edition of the Locked On NBA podcast, wherever you can find the Locked On Grizzlies podcast as your first listen of the day. Check out the Locked On NBA podcast as your second listen. Also want to remind you of our title sponsor for today's show, RockAuto.com. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the car parts you'll ever need. Visit RockAuto.com today. So the Memphis Grizzlies had one of the worst stretches of basketball playing under Taylor Jenkins that they had this past week, especially on Friday and Saturday night, losing by a combined 36 points to the Phoenix Suns and the New Orleans Pelicans, a team of the Pelicans who had entered Saturday's game with just one win. So coming into last night, the Grizzlies were 6-7. That's not all that bad, considering how tough of a start to the season they had schedule-wise. But they clearly were not playing up to their potential. They clearly were not playing good basketball with how many of those losses had resulted in blowouts. Well, on the horizon last night was the Houston Rockets, who I think are clearly in the running to be the worst team in the NBA. Now, I want to make sure when I say that, it's not taken as me saying that this team doesn't have talent. They clearly have plenty of talent. Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, plenty of young players who eventually in time are going to make the Rockets very good, at least I feel. But right now, this Rockets team is just simply not on the level of many other teams in the NBA. But even with that being said, the Grizzlies, with how bad they had struggled and the lack of defense that was being played, plus the Grizzlies' inability to get consistent offense going, listen, even though the Rockets had not been playing well all season, they still were a threat, especially with the natural talent that they had. And what did the Grizzlies do? They go out and win the game 136-103. Now, this may be what everybody expected. This may be the exact result that many expected. There's no reason why the Grizzlies should not beat the Rockets by that much. But to me, that is the single most important thing that stands out about this Grizzlies team. They literally played a full 36 minutes. We're not going to count it 48 because the game was over after the first three quarters. But this Grizzlies team literally played a full 36 minutes the way that they should play. So if you're sitting here not that impressed by this win over the Rockets, I get it. But I do feel it is highly significant that the Grizzlies were able to, after what they had experienced over the weekend, they were able to bounce back. And for the full time that they were expected to, they played at the level that they were, that they had the potential to play to. A couple of fun examples of this are that within the first 15 minutes of the game, the Grizzlies were 5 of 10 from three and had forced 9 turnovers and created 17 points off those turnovers. You want the idea of what the next evolution of this Grizzlies offense is. You want an idea of what Taylor Jenkins envisions being the best opportunity for this Grizzlies offense when they become a sustainable winner and hopeful contender. It's a fast-paced offense that can also feature the three. 17 points off turnovers, 5 of 10 from 3 really set the tone in this game. And that's exactly what Taylor Jenkins also wants to do. He wants the tone to be set in the first quarters, and that's exactly what the Grizzlies did. They scored 105 points through the first 3 quarters of this game. Only the 7th time in franchise history the Grizzlies have done that. 3 of those times have come this calendar year. But the point is that, yes, you certainly expect for the Grizzlies to set the tone in this against this type of opponent. You certainly expect for them to be able to right the ship, but expecting for them to do it and them actually doing it have been 2 very different things over the past 10 days, and they were able to get it done, to get the record back to 500, and now have 2 days to really build off the momentum that they built in this game moving forward. Ja Morant, his same efficient self, 9 of 15 from the field, 4 threes, 22.6 rebounds, 6 assists. Again, I will back up what I mentioned the other day, that Ja Morant is clearly emerging, though he's not clearly getting them night in and night out. Ja Morant is clearly emerging, I feel, to be one of the better triple-double threats in the league, continuing to show impressive rebounding ability, obviously to go with his scoring, his shooting, and his assists. Jaren Jackson Jr., another game, 18 points, 2 threes, 2 steals, 2 blocks, showing how he across the board can make an impact, showing why he can consistently make the moves that need to be made in different areas of the game to impact it. But another thing that stood out about Jaren Jackson Jr. is the fact that he was able to find that balance that we've been talking about. 2 threes, but also there were different variations of Jaren Jackson Jr. going to the rim and finding success. There were a few plays where he posted up in front of the basket, a move that was similar to where he found success through J.B. Bickerstaff his rookie year. He posted up in front of the basket. The Grizzlies perimeter player gave him an entry pass. He made the shot. Jaren, be it able to get to the basket, to find his shot, also was clearly there. You saw Jaren show different variations of how he can find offensive success. Desmond Bane seemed to play his best game that he's played in a while. Dillon Brooks was also very efficient. Just an entire effort from the Grizzlies. No one player had a career game last night. Kyle Anderson, 15 points, 3 threes as well, continuing to show his prowess as a corner three-point threat, which of course we know that Taylor Jenkins really does want to be a big part of the offense, but also contributing in multiple ways. Again, another very good performance from Kyle Anderson. There is a high correlation between when Kyle Anderson has a good game and our bench is advantageous to give the starting lineup a boost to be able to win games. So in many different ways, the Grizzlies were able to get the job done. They, in reality, actually did what was expected of them and on both ends of the court, and that was a great development for this team to work off of. Sometimes the best thing that you need to be or enable to right the ship or get things going back in the right direction is simply to have a game where you are reminded of what you are capable of because you consistently do it over the full game. And that's exactly what the Grizzlies now have to build off of. But another emerging truth for this team that they have to build off of is this. Ja Morant is clearly the best player on this Grizzlies team. And while many of us, including myself, hope Jaren Jackson Jr. steps up to be the clear second best player on this team in time, right now that title goes to Dillon Brooks. And that's exactly what this team needs moving forward. I'll discuss that in just a moment. But I'll tell you this as well. When it comes to the best options that we can consider for things, the best way for a lot of us to be able to get through the day is to find ways to be able to relieve stress. You don't want to let the stress of everyday life weigh on your body. Whether you're an elite athlete or someone like me just trying to get through the day tension-free, Theragun can help. Theragun is a great tool to be able to use. It's a percussive instrument, handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension using a scientifically collaborated combo of depth, speed, and power. And it's quiet as an electric toothbrush. It doesn't just feel good, it gets to the source of pain by releasing tension using Theragun's signature percussive therapy, which goes 60% deeper than vibration alone. Whether you want to treat your muscle tension from working out, an injury, or just the stresses of life, there's no substitute for the Theragun Gen 4. Theragun is trusted by 250 professional sports teams like Real Madrid and elite athletes like Paul George, DeAndre Hopkins, and Maria Sharapova. Try Theragun for 30 days, starting at only $199. Go to therabody.com/lockedon right now and get your Gen 4 Theragun today. That's therabody.com/lockedon, therabody.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen of the day. But the MLB season may be over, and of course we do know who the 2021 World Series champions are. But all bragging aside, the MLB season may be over, but the offseason is already starting to heat up. Major signings over the past 24 hours. Get all the latest news on the baseball teams that you love through the Locked On MLB channel, the Locked On MLB show itself, or the actual episode that covers the team from Locked On that you choose to cheer for. Make sure after you check it out, Locked On Grizzlies, your first listen of the day, that you check out the Locked On MLB show of your choice as your second listen of the day. So the Grizzlies now are 7-7, going into a 2-day rest, regroup period, whatever you want to call it, before they go out on the road and they start to go into what should be a manageable but still tough end to their November schedule. But the thing that has clearly stood out, one of the biggest storylines for the Grizzlies this year and across the NBA this year, is the emergence of Ja Morant as a clear superstar, playing at an all-star, all-NBA level. But when it comes to the Grizzlies, you obviously then ask the question, we know who their best player is. It's Ja Morant. Who is this team's second best player? And the answer is going to differ from what you ideally would like to answer and the answer that is needed. The answer that you want for that question is different from the answer that you need for many Grizzlies fans, I feel. The answer that we want to say with confidence is Jaren Jackson Jr. And it should be because of his potential, because of what he could do in the front court, because him playing at the 5 clearly is starting to show up as being when this team plays its best. We want to say that Jaren Jackson Jr. is the second best player on this team right now. And at times he is. I want to make that clear. At times he is. It's shown up in multiple games this year. And when that's the case, it's a great thing to see him and Ja working off each other and contributing in big ways. But the consistency of Jaren Jackson Jr. being this team's second best player is something that I think keeps him from being the confident answer to the question, who is the Grizzlies' second best player right now? In my opinion, it's clearly Dillon Brooks. And it's not just because he's the Grizzlies' best defender, where Ja is the Grizzlies' obviously best offensive player. It's not just because of Dillon Brooks being the team's best defender. It's the combination of him being the team's best defender as well as this team's second consistent scoring option. That's the thing about this answer to the question, who is the Grizzlies' second best player? It's the consistency of knowing what you're going to get from Dillon, and the fact that now, when we know what we get from Dillon, it's a much better contribution than it was in the past. It's true. I know that Dillon may not be the most ideal candidate to be the Grizzlies' second best player. The Grizzlies going forward as a sustainable winner or championship contender, that's not likely with Dillon Brooks being the second best player on this team over the next several years. But for right now, for a team and a roster that is trying to navigate its way through some tough waters when it comes to the struggles of a young team in the NBA, having as much consistency as possible, especially when it comes to a player who can be so consistent on both ends of the court, it's a good development to have. Now, obviously, us having this conversation 15 months ago would have been a very scary proposition. However, one of the biggest reasons why I support Dillon Brooks being this team's second best player is, again, because of his offense. Not as much of his defense. His defense is still where Dillon Brooks offers the most value. But his offense also stands out. Consider this. In the first half of last year, Dillon Brooks, on nearly 15 shots a game, was averaging 16 points, shooting just under 40% from the field, 32% from three, and 83% from the free throw line. He was contributing around 3 rebounds, 2.5 assists, 2 turnovers per game. Dillon was clearly struggling. He was a player, though his defense was making him valuable, he still was that type of player, that polarizing type of player who sometimes it was great when he was playing well. It certainly was a big contributing factor to the Grizzlies winning. But if he was not playing well on offense, it could certainly be a reason why they weren't playing as well as many liked. But again, remember those numbers. In the first half of last year, 16 points per game, 39% from the field, 32% from three, and 83% from the free throw line. Over his past 50 games, though, over his past 50 regular season games, the numbers for Dillon take a significant step forward. Again, in the first half of last year, 16 points per game, just under 40% from the field, 32% from three, and 83% from the line. Over his past 50 games, his past 50 regular season games in his career, 18 points per game, 43.5% from the field, 37% from three. And we're talking about on 5.5 attempts per game, he's shooting 37% from three, 83% from the line. A true shooting percentage of 53.5. It's similar to what he did his rookie year, basically doubling his three-point production. But when you go from the first half of last season, basically when you look at through Valentine's Day of last year, and then you see what he was then to what he has been over the past 50 games of his career in the regular season, you see a clear step forward. And the fact that he has maintained that type of progression over a 50-game sample size, again, I'm not saying that Dillon Brooks is now one of the best two-way players in the league, but there clearly has been not only a step up in his offensive production, but the effectiveness of that offensive production. And the big key is this: it's sustaining. We're talking about 50 games. We're talking about for more than half a season. Again, I know that still in and of itself is a pretty small sample size, but we're not talking about just a week. This is not what he's done in 3 games this year. This is what he's done in the past 50 games of his career. Now, think about this. I'm not even including the play-in and playoffs where Dillon was averaging over 22, 23 points per game on nearly 50% shooting and 40% from three. The step up that we have been waiting to see, the step up that many of us were questioning in the bubble whether or not it would ever happen, we acknowledged that it did happen to a certain extent last year. And I know 3 games shouldn't change that this season. But the fact that Dillon has put up the numbers that he has over the past 50 games of his career, you look at the fact that he's able to step right in and produce the same way he did towards the end of last season after being off for 3 weeks due to a wrist injury in the offseason. He's able to come right back in and contribute like he has. And then you also consider on the bigger stages, he goes to an even bigger level when it comes to his production in the play-in and playoffs. That really is showing something for Dillon Brooks. Now, again, he's not the most ideal second best player on the team. He's not someone that's going to be the second best player on the team, I think, for a sustainable winner on a contender. You want that player to be a Jaren Jackson Jr., or you want that player to be another star that the Grizzlies may be in. But for right now, with Jaren not consistently being the answer to who is the Grizzlies' second best player, it is a very good development that you can clearly say consistently that Dillon is this team's second best player. Because then when Jaren actually does perform like the Grizzlies' best player other than Ja Morant, you then have Dillon coming right under that with his consistency. So it's obviously a great thing that Ja Morant not only has clearly shown he's the Grizzlies' number 1 option when it comes to game activity, when it comes to production, when it comes to impact, or what player is the biggest reason why the Grizzlies win games. It's clearly Ja Morant. But after that, instead of the Grizzlies going through games where you can't really say, okay, after Ja Morant, what player is the Grizzlies' second biggest reason why they win games? You want the answer to that question to be Jaren Jackson Jr. as often as possible. But if that's not the case right now, it's a good thing to have the fact that Dillon Brooks consistently is the answer to who is the Grizzlies player who is the second biggest reason why the Grizzlies win games. That is a very good development. Yes, it may not be the most ideal outcome, but a lot of times the most ideal outcome requires patience. And in the process of getting to the most ideal outcome, if you can at least have an acceptable or favorable outcome, that you're perfectly fine being the case until you get the most ideal outcome, that's a very good position to be in. Because once Jaren Jackson Jr. finds this consistency that we all hope he does as a two-way player to clearly be the Grizzlies' second best player, just think of how much better in a position they'll be once they can say Ja Morant is our most impactful player, Jaren Jackson Jr. is our second best player, but I'll stack Dillon Brooks as our third most impactful player against many other teams' third most impactful player in the NBA. That's why this is a good development. So yes, I get Jaren Jackson Jr.'s consistency is something we all hope certainly improves in time. We want him to be the Grizzlies' second best player as frequently as possible moving forward. But if that is something that's still going to remain inconsistent into the near future, it's nice to know that Dillon Brooks can step up and be that consistent second best player for the Grizzlies to support Ja, support the offense and the defense, and also play a big role in the Grizzlies being able to win games. But speaking of playing a big role in the Grizzlies being able to win games, some lineups are starting to emerge that really could allow for the Grizzlies to have these anchor points they can rely on moving forward. I'll discuss that in just a moment. Listen, I talk all the time about the Grizzlies wanting to have options, them having options that they can rely on to make their performance better. Well, I can tell you this, if you need an option to rely on to make your daily performance better, look no further than Built Bar. It's the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, provides great health benefits, provides a boost to your day, tastes great as well. Have it in the morning for breakfast or in the afternoon as a snack. And if you go to Built.com right now, you not only get to choose from over 18 different flavors, but you also can put in the promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your next order from Built Bar. You can go to Built.com, put in the promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your next order from Built Bar. Also, when it comes to options that you want to rely on making performance better, there are plenty of things that have to be working together to make your car run as effectively as possible. But if in time you need to upgrade those parts, no better place to go than rockauto.com. For one, it's very easy to use. Within a few clicks of the button, you're likely going to find what you need. Regardless of make and model, regardless of the part, it's likely going to be there. And if you go to rockauto.com right now, you're going to be able to run into a source that's economically friendly. This is a family-owned business. They've been in business for more than 20 years. They know that a lot of times car parts potentially fall out of folks' budgets. And so they try to make things as economically friendly as possible. If you visit rockauto.com, let them know that we here at the Locked On Podcast Network sent you. rockauto.com, amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the car parts that you'll ever need. Visit rockauto.com today. On tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast, I talked about Dillon Brooks being back, being the second best player on this team. But another player that I think is really starting to step up, really finding his groove, is Kyle Anderson. And I know that he's struggled defensively, but there is clear signs that his shot is back to where it was last year and is sustainable as well. His importance to the Grizzlies, plus much more on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. So we talked about the fact that the Grizzlies do now have a game to build off of. And with Dillon Brooks being back, they now have right now a player that I consider to be their second best player, their second most consistent source of productivity on both ends of the court, and a player who really has stepped up his offensive game and the consistency of his offensive game to help out Ja Morant. But another thing, but obviously where Dillon Brooks makes his biggest impact, where he makes his money, for lack of a better word, is on defense. And one of the most fun things over the past 3 games that he has played that has really emerged is this. Of any 3-man lineup that has played more than 30 minutes together for the Grizzlies this year, the 5 lineups that have the best defensive ratings all include Dillon Brooks. There's your proof of just how impactful Dillon Brooks being back is. A defense that is arguably being the worst in the league. Dillon Brooks is not going to solve all the problems. But the mere inclusion of him in the defense already is showing up in these lineup statistics. The trios with the best defensive ratings for the Grizzlies, they all contain Dillon Brooks. And I talked about it yesterday on Twitter. I talked about the fact that the best way for me to describe Dillon Brooks being back is simply this. Obviously, when it comes to defenses in the NBA, there are so many responsibilities that fall on these players. But at the end of the day, the main one is this. Who on the opposition is the biggest threat to consistently burn us, to consistently score? If defenses have to consider that as their priority to stop, it is so much easier when an NBA defense can easily identify one person on their team to take on that responsibility. And not only that, one person on their team who thrives on taking on that responsibility. And when that happens, that takes, not necessarily that the rest of the defenders don't have to worry about it, but now they can put a bigger focus on other things that they do well. And that's the impact that Dillon Brooks makes. With him back, Kyle Anderson, Ja, Jaren, D'Anthony Melton, Desmond Bane, the other Grizzlies' main rotation players, they know with Dillon back, he's going to be the first line of defense against the other team's high usage, biggest threat, more than likely. And if that's the case, it then allows these Grizzlies players to focus more on their own assignments, focus more on their own rotations, help defense. And for me, their opportunistic nature, that when the Grizzlies are playing opportunistic defense, that's when they're at their best. Last night, 18 turnovers caused, 33 points off those turnovers. A lot of it was because the Grizzlies were able to create havoc off the ball. Because that's another thing that stands out about these defensive lineups is that D'Anthony Melton, Kyle, even Ja, who's done a great job this year, Jaren, Xavier Tillman, many of the Grizzlies rotation players are very aware and astute off-ball defenders, especially when it comes to causing deflections, havoc, or turnovers. Those players now can focus on those parts of the defense. That aspect of the defense, they have an easier time focusing on those areas of the defense since Dillon is back to take on the opposition's best scorer. So again, Dillon's not going to solve all the Grizzlies' problems, but the one thing that he's going to do, he's going to make it easier for the rest of the roster to have a better time of focusing on what they're supposed to do, and that should have a trickle-down effect to allow for the Grizzlies to become more effective at defending the three, creating turnovers, defending the lane, and so on. But another thing that certainly stands out, and I've talked about it, and yesterday, Chris Harrington of the Daily Memphis brought up a great point. Coming into last night's game, in their previous 5 games, over that stretch in the NBA, in the amount of days that it took the Grizzlies to play their previous 5 games coming into last night, Memphis was 29th in effective field goal percentage. But they also had allowed the highest effective field goal percentage, the highest opponent's effective field goal percentage of anybody in the NBA. Basically, the Grizzlies were arguably the worst team at selecting their own shot, but they clearly were the worst team at allowing the offense to select their own shot. Now, some of that may have had to do with luck. Other things, in time, things could regress to where that's not the case. But clearly what it is that the Grizzlies were not doing very good at making the right decisions when it came to finding the best shot each and every time down the court. But the Grizzlies' opposition, they were having no trouble at all consistently finding the best shot. Well, if that's the case, obviously Dillon being back should help that aspect of things, should help make it tougher for the Grizzlies' opposition to find their best shot on a frequent basis when the opposition is on offense. But the lineup of Desmond Bane, Ja Morant, Kyle Anderson, and Jaren Jackson Jr., that lineup this year has over 65%. They have a 65% effective field goal percentage and a 65% true shooting percentage. Why is that encouraging? The Grizzlies have a reliable lineup, and you throw Dillon into that as well. The lineup of Ja, Bane, Dillon, Kyle, and Jaren, that is a lineup for the Grizzlies to go to with confidence if they feel that the offense is stagnant and is having a tough time finding the best shot each and every offensive possession they take. And that should be something over the next 2 days that stands out. If the Grizzlies offense is struggling, put that lineup in there and see what happens. Ja, Bane, Dillon Brooks, Kyle Anderson, and Jaren Jackson Jr. And we've talked about it before, right? That lineup of Ja, Dillon, Kyle, and Jaren, that was the quartet that we base our closing lineup of, that me and many others have talked about being the go-to quartet in high leverage or closing situations. But the numbers show you throw Desmond Bane in there, that's your best lineup when it comes to finding the right shot on offense. Take Desmond Bane out, you put DeAnthony Melton in there, that's probably your best defense when it comes to creating turnovers and getting stops. So the numbers clearly back, with Dillon Brooks being back, that the Grizzlies have a lineup structure for them to go to when they really need to get the game going in their direction. Ja, Dillon, Kyle, and Jaren on the court together in whatever scenario you find. Whether it's playing from behind and you're needing to catch up by getting good effective shots, put Bane in there. You're with the lead, but you want to play good defense to get stops, put Melton in there. Build off that quartet, because the numbers certainly show that when that quartet is playing together, good things happen. The production of the quartet of Ja, Dillon, Kyle, and Jaren, the numbers that quartet of players produce when they're on the court, that offers solutions to the Grizzlies' biggest weaknesses. And that's why that lineup should be featured more often. So the return of Dillon Brooks certainly is having its impact defensively. But the Grizzlies also, I feel, have the lineup combination with Bane and Anderson and Ja and Jaren and Dillon together. They've got the lineup combination also that they can use to make sure that they can get their offense the boost that it needs. If it comes out to being stagnant during games, they now have a go-to lineup to help them out in those situations. So that's the thing that emerged from last night. You've got a clear number 2 option on offense and your number 1 option on defense to go to besides Ja Morant, that's Dillon Brooks. And now the Grizzlies also have a couple of different lineup combinations they can go to if they need to get things going in the right direction on offense and defense. And I would say this, these emergences, these go-to options of having a clear number 2 best player right now and having a couple of lineup combinations you can utilize when you need to get things going in the right direction, that's a good thing to know with 2 days off, because now the Grizzlies have a way to be able to put together how they can utilize this knowledge more to help them stay consistent and be able to win more games moving forward. Can't thank you enough for joining us here on the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. You can find me at StatsSAC, the show at Locked On Grizz. You can find the podcast wherever it's available, and you can find the show right here on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button below. Again, we'll be back with you tomorrow talking the latest things Grizzlies, plus the improving impact of Kyle Anderson sustaining the success that he had last year. That and much more on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. We'll talk to you soon. Have a